Welcome, warriors. This episode is being released on April 2nd, 2024, also officially known as World Autism Awareness Day, with April being World Autism Awareness Month. However, the young man who is a major contributor to this podcast behind the scenes has joined others in renaming this month Autism Acceptance Month. He, among others, believes that we've moved beyond the simple concept of being aware that autism exists, and it's time to promote acceptance of those who have an autism diagnosis. Grab a tissue. It's time to talk about the role of autism in my life, the trauma and beauty I've experienced, and how proud I am of my son, Tristan, who happens to be the guy who composed the music you hear at the beginning and the end of this podcast. The guy who stitches everything together and makes any edits I need. And the guy I love with my heart and soul. I can honestly say he's my favorite son. Let's rock.
Does your past haunt you? Maybe you're in a storm that feels like it will never end. Are you fighting a battle that's rendering you hopeless? Maybe you feel like you're fighting alone, but your battle was not meant to be a solo endeavor. You were meant to be a warrior among warriors. My name is Heather, and I grew up thinking my battles were nobody's business until I found myself in an abusive marriage and felt cut off from all avenues of help. In this podcast, you will hear warriors' words. They will tell you of their battles, both won and lost, their journeys, and their lessons learned along the way. But we don't stop there. These warriors will share how they have applied those lessons to go from warrior to survivor to thriver. Whether it's an abusive marriage, illness, mental health crisis, or any number of traumas this world dishes out, these warriors will use their words to help you find the beauty in your broken, move beyond your battles, and become the thriver God created you to be. Pick up your sword or boxing gloves and join the battle. Your words are powerful, my friends. Make them warrior words.
Welcome back to the Warrior Words podcast. I mentioned my favorite son at the end of my intro, but I also have a favorite daughter. Maybe we'll hear about her later. But let's get started with this review from Wooster. I love that name. Wooster writes, an important voice. What a wonderful start. These first episodes are raw and real, but also uplifting, with a bit of humor. There are so many women who need to hear what you have to say. Keep up the good work. Thank you so much, Wooster, for being one of my earliest listeners and leaving those kind words. I'm trusting that the Holy Spirit will deliver this podcast to those who need to hear our stories. Would you like me to read your review on an upcoming episode? Please go to Apple Podcasts and leave a review for the show. Your comments and star ratings help people find the Warrior Words podcast. It only takes a few minutes of your time, and it would help so much. Thank you. And if you have not already subscribed to my email list, please go to subscribepage.io/Pearls of Wisdom, and that link will be in the show notes for you. Now on to today's episode, because there's no bio to read, because it's just me talking today. So as of this recording, there's not one definitive cause of autism. And because of that, I'm choosing to share the trauma of my pregnancy and delivery because it fits both the theme of this podcast and it serves as a starting point to our story. I am not making any claims that the way my delivery unfolded is the cause of my son's autism. The truth is that we just don't know, and we may never be able to pinpoint exactly what caused it. And I suspect that Tristan himself would say, for him, that the cause no longer matters, as it is what he's doing now that counts. So let's start at the beginning. I originally wanted a home birth and to have everything as natural as possible. Those of you who know me may be laughing at the moment if you don't already know the story. My husband at the time objected to this, and in hindsight, he was absolutely correct. But we ended up compromising, and I agreed to a hospital birth, and he agreed to a midwife instead of a traditional OBGYN. We started we started with a disagreement about my due date, me and that midwife. And so I guess it didn't start out very well. They gave me a due date toward the end of September, but by my calculations, I thought it should have been closer to the beginning of the month. During my first trimester, I had some bleeding that they couldn't or I couldn't explain. And so they put me on 3 days of bed rest. But other than that, my pregnancy was relatively unremarkable. In my last trimester, though, people started asking me if I was having twins. This kid was huge, and therefore so was my belly. My due date came and went with no movement. 8 days after my due date, I went to the hospital for an AFI, and that's an amniotic fluid index, which is basically done via sonogram. So while they were looking at the amount of amniotic fluid, spoiler alert, there was none. I asked if she could check the size of my son. They've done that in previous sonograms, so why not? But she said she was not allowed to do that because it was not part of the midwife's order. Had she taken the time to do that? Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. So back to that spoiler alert. There was no amniotic fluid. None. Zip, zilch, nada. My water never broke, so I was at a loss. But what that meant was that I was not going to leave the hospital. I was going to be admitted instead. It was time to induce labor. Without amniotic fluid, he would need to be delivered soon. Once admitted, they administered whatever the medication was that induces labor after all these years. I don't remember. Then they attempted an epidural 4 times. I had scoliosis. No, I have scoliosis. That hasn't gone away. I have scoliosis, and they had a horrible time trying to get that needle in there. The rest of the day and the night was uneventful. I was teased by multiple people because I insisted on watching baseball throughout the whole thing. As many games as I could get, I guess. A girl's got to have some fun, right? When the midwife arrived in the morning, though, she checked, and I still had not fully dilated. I was well after my due date. I had 0 amniotic fluid and still had not fully dilated, despite being induced. So it was time for the doctors to take over. They made several attempts to force labor, including something called fundal pushing, and eventually they tried forceps. My son did not seem to want to enter this world on his own. At some point, they all left the room. And when they returned, they told me that both my son and I were in danger, as our blood pressures were both dropping. They advised an emergency cesarean section. And that scared me on multiple levels. But there were really no other options at that point. So I agreed, or we agreed, and I was prepped for surgery. They gave me a nerve block, and I was able to be awake in the operating room and be able to see Tristan as he was officially born. But thank goodness they put a screen. They put a screen up so I couldn't see everything, and I'm grateful for that. But I was able to see him immediately, right away, after so long. So long. He was finally here, and I was able to hold him in my arms. And he was huge. He was just shy of 2 feet tall, and he was the second largest baby on record at the hospital on that date. I don't know if they broke it since then, but second largest as of his birthday. And the doctors told me later that had they been able to get his head out naturally, they would have had to break his collarbone in order to get his shoulders out. So I am very grateful they didn't have to do that. So they took him for testing, the usual stuff, and they wheeled me off to recovery. I fell asleep, but I awoke to alarms and someone pushing on my belly because I was bleeding. Gratefully, they got it under control, and that was the last of the trauma in the hospital. At home, there were two things that kind of stood out as Tristan grew to a toddlerhood. First, he had a horrible time sleeping. He did not fall asleep easily. Now, once he got to sleep, that was better. But falling asleep, not so easy. He didn't seem to mind the crib, but if I left the room before he was fully asleep, he would cry a lot. As a first-time mother, I had no idea how much crying was normal. I did remember reading that I was supposed to let him cry, to cry it out, and that he'd eventually fall asleep. And then he would eventually learn that he was okay and going to sleep in his crib was normal. I tried, but I felt awful sitting there listening to him cry. He didn't seem to be learning like the experts said he was supposed to. I gave up on that idea, and I would sit beside his crib on the floor in the dark with my arm through one of the slats on the side of the crib, maintaining that physical connection with him. On many nights, I literally crawled out of his room. The other thing that stood out is that his cheeks would get really inflamed, and nothing we did seemed to make them better. The doctor tried all the medications, all the creams, everything, and nothing worked. We were then referred to an allergist for testing. It turned out that he was allergic to peanuts, garlic, and eggs. And I had been eating a lot of Italian-based casseroles. So that meant the garlic and the egg came through to him through my breast milk. And then we would soon discover that garlic and egg were in a majority of the foods I was eating. Also, onion. Onion is grown and it's processed like in the same area as garlic. And so we had to avoid onion as well as the garlic. That first grocery trip, y'all, after the allergist took over 3 hours because I had to read all of the labels. And then the allergist told me that just because you read them once doesn't mean you don't have to read them again, because they change. They change their ingredients, they change their formulas, they change their recipes, and they don't have to put that on the labels, or at least they didn't at the time. So those were the two things that stand out to me from his early years. And like I said, I don't know if our birth trauma contributed to his autism or not. I don't know if his subsequent sleep and allergy issues showed up because of the birth trauma or the autism. I can't definitively state a cause and effect. I just know that my son's entry into this world was not normal. After all of that, I'm sometimes surprised that I agreed to have another child. But our bad memories fade. And then we remember the feeling of our child, our baby in our arms, and the thoughts of the trauma diminish. And so I did have another child, and she is my favorite daughter. Given the trauma of that first birth of Tristan, we planned a C-section for her and then scheduled it 2 weeks before my due date. So theoretically, I would go into labor before that, and I didn't. And that C-section went as planned. However, when she was weighed, 2 weeks before her due date, the doctors told me that had we let her go full term, she would have been close to her brother in weight. That to me is a miracle. We were led to schedule the C-section in advance so as to avoid the trauma of the first delivery. Had she been close to the size of her brother, we might have had a part 2 of that birth trauma. But thankfully, we don't. But we do have a part 2 of this episode. Next week, I will talk about how the word autism entered my vocabulary. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast to get notified of when it's released. Until then, armor up, fight the good fight, seek beauty, and make your words warrior words. God bless.